This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Have you ever stopped to think about how the modern world was basically built from 3 completely different blueprints and all drawn up right next door to each other? Well, we're about to jump into a 300-year-old mystery, a story that spans England, France, and Germany, to figure out why their paths to modernity were just so incredibly different. So here's the central puzzle, right? How on earth did 3 neighboring countries, all of them cultural powerhouses, end up with such wildly different obsessions? England gave us modern science. France gave us political revolution. And Germany gave us this dense, systematic philosophy. Why? Why wasn't it the other way around? The answer, and this is the really cool part, isn't found in some vague idea about national character. No, it's much more concrete than that. It's all about the unique, urgent, and very real national challenges that each country was staring down. The ideas they came up with weren't just for academic debates. They were tools built to solve life or death problems. And to really get this, we're going to look at 3 titans of thought: Isaac Newton in England, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France, and Immanuel Kant in Germany. You look at their fields, natural science, political philosophy, and systematic philosophy, and they couldn't be more different. And that, it turns out, was no accident at all. They were each answering the call of their nation.
Think of these as the secret missions that drove everything they did. The English? They needed to measure the world to create some order. The French? They had to figure out how to overthrow a state they saw as a tyrant. And the Germans, who didn't really have a unified state to begin with, first needed to explain what a state even was. These weren't just books, they were battle plans. All right, so let's dive into our first case file, 17th century England. Now, to understand English thinking, you first have to understand the deep national trauma it was born from. I mean, England had been through hell. Seriously. They'd fought a horrific civil war, they'd actually executed their own king, and they lived through decades of political chaos. So, more than anything else, England's most urgent, desperate need was just stability. They needed a practical way to manage the world so that society would never, ever fall apart like that again. Now, the timing here is absolutely crucial. You see, England dealt with its huge political crisis, that whole struggle between the king and the people, really early on. By 1688, with the Glorious Revolution, the big question of who held the power was more or less settled. And that freed up the country's best minds to start focusing on a whole different set of problems. So here's the key takeaway. England developed a set of really practical tools. Empiricism, the idea that you should trust what you can actually see and measure, became the main way of thinking. This directly leads to Newton discovering the physical laws of the universe, and you have thinkers like Hobbes and Locke trying to do the same thing for society, discover its natural laws. They weren't just arguing abstractly, they were measuring and building. Okay, let's hop across the channel to France now, where the national problem was pretty much the exact opposite of England's. It wasn't about recovering from chaos. Oh no, it was about intentionally creating it. In the 18th century, France was just suffocating under the weight of an absolute king and a super powerful Catholic Church. There was no real parliament to challenge the king's power. So for French thinkers, intellectual life wasn't some calm, quiet inquiry. It was a battleground. Their entire job was to forge ideas that could be used as weapons against the old regime. And this is where that timeline becomes so important again. The French Revolution in 1789, it happened almost exactly 100 years after England's Glorious Revolution. That century-long lag is everything. It meant that while England was off building a stable commercial empire, France was busy building the intellectual case for blowing their own system up. And their intellectual arsenal was perfectly designed for this fight. French thinkers championed rationalism, the idea that pure reason, not some king or ancient tradition, was the one true source of authority. Guys like Rousseau weren't measuring society as it was. They were in their armchairs designing the ideal society from scratch. Their goal wasn't stability, it was liberation. And finally, that brings us to Germany. Germany faced a problem that wasn't about oppression or chaos, but about absence. There was no unified state to fix or to overthrow, so they had to create one. Not with armies, but with ideas. You have to remember, at this time, Germany wasn't a country. It was this chaotic patchwork of over 300 separate little kingdoms and cities, no central government, no single army, nothing. So the biggest challenge was just incredibly fundamental. How do you forge a German people if there is no German state? So Germany was in a really tough spot.
It couldn't compete with England's scientific and industrial power, and it was way too fragmented to have a French-style political revolution. So what did German thinkers do? They turned inward. They figured if they couldn't unify the nation on the ground, they would unify it in the mind.
Their solution was something totally new, a huge, all-encompassing, systematic philosophy that could act as a kind of unifying national culture, a national spirit. Thinkers like Kant basically started this project of rational theology, using the super rigorous language of philosophy to rebuild a shared sense of meaning and purpose. It was a state built not of land, but of ideas. So what happens when you line these three stories up next to each other? Well, you get this stunningly clear pattern. It's almost like a gradient flowing across Europe, where each country's intellectual life is perfectly tailored to its unique history.
And it all snaps into focus when you look at how each nation dealt with the old foundation of Europe, religion. In England, theology just kind of quietly faded into the background as science took over. In France, theology was the enemy, the big boss you had to defeat with reason. But in Germany, it was the only foundation they had left, so it had to be protected and rebuilt with the most powerful tools they could invent.
So right here, this is the whole story in one place. Each nation's dominant way of thinking wasn't some random accident. It was a direct, logical response to its biggest, most pressing problem. English science created stability. French philosophy created a revolution. And German philosophy, well, it created a nation in spirit.
But all of this leads us to one final, really fascinating question about the very nature of what we even call philosophy. Yeah, why is that? Why is it that when we think of big, systematic philosophy, with a capital P, we immediately think of Germans like Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche? Why didn't that kind of thinking really take off in England or France? Well, it turns out philosophy had a secret mission. See, philosophy, at least in the modern world, doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It gets called into action when theology, the traditional source of all meaning, is under attack. You could say philosophy becomes theology's bodyguard.
Just think about it. It makes perfect sense. In England, science and theology had a kind of quiet truce, so no bodyguard was needed. In France, political thinkers were the assassins, and theology was their main target. It was only in Germany, where theology was the fragile last hope for national unity, that it needed a champion to defend it from English science and French skepticism. And that champion was German philosophy.
This just reframes everything, doesn't it? It suggests philosophy isn't just a pure search for truth, but a kind of defense system that gets activated in times of cultural crisis. And that leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought. In our own, often fragmented world, what core ideas are so under threat that they might need philosophy to come to their defense? What is philosophy's secret mission right now?
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.